Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this webinar on the transition from XEVMPD to ISO IDMP organized by Asphalion. We are your speakers today. My name is Lidia Canovas, General Manager of Regulatory Affairs at Asphalion. I'm here with my colleague Ramon Hernandez, Senior Regulatory Information Specialist and Project Manager. May we go to the next slide, please? Well, I see that there is still people joining the session. Welcome everyone again. So a few words about Asphalion. For those of you who don't know us yet, we are a consultancy service company with offices in Barcelona, Madrid, Munich, and London. We work in international scientific and regulatory affairs consultancy. Our company was founded 20 years ago, and we are over 120 members. And we work worldwide in a huge number of projects accumulated in our 20 years of the life of our company. In the next slide, you can see a brief overview of our services. So we do work in the support in all phases of the product development, starting with regulatory and scientific strategy during early development, medical and scientific writing, global submissions, e-submissions and data management, life cycle, and pharmacovigilance, working in a span of products, wide span of products such as drug, generics, biologics, biosimilars, ATMP, medical device, and orphan drugs. Both Ramon and myself belong to the data management unit at Asphalion. Having said this introduction, we have a lot of material to present today. However, we will do our best to make room for questions. Please be so kind to write your questions in the chat of the Teams, and at the end of the session, we will respond what we can, what time allows us, and all other questions will be answered via email. Thank you so much, and please, Ramon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lidia. So our topic today is how to make a smooth transition towards ISO IDMP. So we cannot start talking about this transition without understanding what ISO IDMP is. So I'm not going to spend that much time on that part. I just want to make an introduction of how it's born from this need of standardization. So it's not only standardization between the countries or between the departments of the company, it's also across the whole global pharma. So this is just a simple example of how in the different departments the different people working on there, and they are referring to the same term, but they are saying it on a different way. So a way of standardizing this, and this is something that you will see a lot in the future, is using IDs. Instead of saying this is hard capsule, or capsule, hard, we are just using this ID. So when it's not the persons talking, but machines speaking with machines, they refer to this ID. So then there is a preferred term, and this is the one that should be used in your systems, but all the different synonyms are mapped with this ID. So this is an idea that we will see a lot in all the different portals and programs and in all the databases that we have in our company, but especially we will have this in sport. So we will talk about sport later, but first let's jump into what ISO IDMP is. So this is a slide that you have probably seen in other webinars. This cake, let's say, that it's building ISO IDMP in the different layers. So on a first layer, we will have this standard that is defining how to actually define the control vocabularies. Then we have another standard with the units of measurements, another standard with the substances, a different one to define our pharmaceutical products, taking into account the different standards we just described. And finally, we will define our medicinal product. So I've said a lot the word standard, and this is because ISO IDMP, it actually comes from the ISO, this is standardization organization. So let's not lose focus of this, because this is something global. We are not talking only about Europe. Although we will focus on the approach of EMA on the application of those standards made by the ISO. And the word ISO IDMP stands for Identification of Medicinal Products. So at the end, we are just trying to build all these different IDs in order to identify our product on different levels, from the substance to the final product and even the batch. So you should not focus in the IDs themselves, because this may be a little bit complicated. Just so you know, and they start ringing a bell, let's say, we will have the MPID that defines our medicinal product. And this one will be used a lot in the future as well. It's the one related to the packaging. And if some of you have worked in serialization projects before, this may be something you have encountered in the past, because in the EMBO guidance, it was mentioning this PCID, and nobody knew where this was coming from. But it was because IDMP was not implemented at the moment, and it's not yet. And then I mentioned it before, but we need to have an understanding of this before talking about how to implement IDMP in our company, and it's the use of SPOR. So this is not something new. This has been going on for a few years already. So SPOR is the initial approach EMA had on implementing IDMP on the European Union. And it started the basis of how we use the master data in all the different regulatory processes. So at the end, it's just this portal that is divided in 4 blocks, let's say. One is for the substances. So is where we can, according to the standard published by the ISO team, define the different substances that we will encounter in in our products. It doesn't have to be only the active substance; it's also the excipients. So you can imagine the amount of work that it's been cleaning this database, because we have many substances in all the products that we have in Europe. But also just remember that this is an standardization project. It will be global at some point. So it's not only checking the different substances we have in Europe, also the ones FDA have, and how this will communicate in the future. So it's a huge project, and there's a lot of cleaning to do, and there's still a lot to do until we are in the future we want. Then we also have this database full of all the organizations that we need. So this is not only the marketing authorization holders. We, as Palion, as a third-party provider, a consultancy, we're in there. All the manufacturers that you have to reference for your product should be there. Actually, if you have used an application for in the last 3 years, I think even 4, there's this section where you have to, well, you have to reference different organizations. So you still have this box where you can type the name of the organization, maybe the manufacturer, and that address. But you also have the option to search for it, and then the information is automatically populated. Just so you know, because it's quite important. For centralized procedures, it will be mandatory soon to complete the information this way in the application form. So you should definitely check if the organizations that are related to your products are in there and if they are okay. And if not, you should get familiar for sure now what the different process for requesting new organizations, locations, ornamented ones are already there, because it takes some time and it will definitely impact your regulatory activities. Then we also have the referentials. So this is just a series of lists with the terms and control vocabularies that, that are used everywhere, coming back to the application form. If you have to select, I don't know, pharmaceutical dose form, when you have this drop-down menu and you select film code tablet, this is coming directly from here. And you have all the translations on the different languages of the European Union. You have descriptions of the term. Everything should be there. And finally, if we combine all the control vocabularies, the organizations, and the substances, we can finally define our product. So this is the product database that we aim to have in the future. So we will call it from now on PMS, from Product Master Services. And I say this because in some of the slides we'll see in the future, when we talk about the submission on an ISO IDMP format, we are also referring to submissions to PMS. So this will be the new database that EMA will have with all the information of our products on an ISO IDMP format. It will be, let's say, the future version of the current XEVMPD database we have now. So I've been talking also about XEVMPD and how one database will be the other one. So let's just put a little bit of history on a timeline. I'm not really going to get into details, but this is the point where XEVMPD was launched. And maybe the most important is when it became mandatory. So it was in July of 2012. I was not really there when this happened, but I can imagine that a few months before it became mandatory, all the different marketing authorizations were typing all the information on the products and trying to send it in the last minute. So this is kind of what we want to avoid in the implementation as ISO IDMP. So we are ready before the deadline, and we are not working extra hours trying to submit all the information. I did not mention it before, but XEVMPD stands from External Audit Vigilance based in a product dictionary. So it's just its database containing structured data about our products, because, well, EMA for different regulatory activities, and especially for pharmacovigilance, needed to have a global database where they could really know the status of the different products. And also, if we have them identified, we can reference them in the different activities. So this is what's happening with serialization, for example, that we have to find a way of relating the information in EMBO with our products. So we're using this EB code. It's the identifier generated in this database. It's used in other processes. For example, if you are creating a delivery file from a PSUR, so you have to have it registered in this database in order to select the product. Well, you have to have it registered anyways because it's mandatory, but that's another story. Then finally, in 2016, the European implementation guidance on how ISO IDMP will be implemented in Europe should have been released. So this was the initial go live that was expected. We are in 2021 and we are still having this conversation about ISO IDMP. So there has been for sure a series of delays. So this is not only EMA's fault, because there are a lot of factors in here. For example, the ISO standards has to be finalized before. Then we had Brexit and the whole relocation of the agency. So if we move forward, we are at the point where this guidance was actually released in 2019. And then coming back to this year, maybe this is going ahead of the presentation, but on February this year, the version 2.0 of this implementation guidance was released to the public. And this is supposed to be the trigger to the actual implementation deadlines. So we will talk about this later. And well, we are at this point now where we actually have to start looking forward for the implementation, and we cannot sleep on it. We really have to understand what we need to do. So I hope at the end of this presentation, you have an understanding of the different steps. This is not just to make you scary, but this is how the whole data model will look like. So this is a lot of information and different granularity on how we should identify and define our product. But just to make it a little bit simple, we can see that our medicinal product, it's composed on different, let's call it posits now, in order to make it easier. But we have all this link to the different organizations that are affecting our product. So as you can imagine, this is coming directly from the O part from SPOR that we were mentioning before. So we have to define, for example, who the marketing authorization holder is. So we will not write it. This will be a direct link to the marketing authorization holder in SPOR. All the manufacturers, manufacturer of the active substance and the different roles for the packaging, everything will be coming from here. Then we have all the information related to the marketing authorization, all the information related to the packaging and the composition, and also the clinical particulars. This is just so you get an idea that the information covered in ISO IDMP is not something exclusive from regulatory affairs. This is affecting the whole product itself. So first we need to understand what the data fields are and where we can find them. So it may be complicated, the whole data model, we saw it was massive. And in this graphic representation, we have more than 400 different data fields. Achieving this from one day to another is completely impossible. So we have to build a stair in order to going from one step to the other one. The first one would be XEVMPD. So this is our starting point. We have already been reporting information about our products for several years. So we have built this XEVMPD database with basic information on our product. And then we will go towards this iteration one. And this is something that maybe I didn't mention before. In order to go to the full scope of ISO IDMP, we have to go through iterations. So when we talk about the implementation of ISO IDMP in Europe, we are always referring to this iteration one. So this iteration one is basically what we have from XEVMPD. It will suffer a direct one-to-one migration. But then we have some data fields that cannot be directly migrated. There will be some parsing and some rules that may not be, I mean, they are correct, but they are complicated, and depending on the quality of the data we have in XEVMPD, it can lead to errors. But that's our starting point. And then we have all the new data fields that we did not have before. We have to report them. We have to understand where they are coming from, if we are really storing it, who is responsible of generating this information. Just to give you some examples, we will have all these internal IDs that we did not have before. So in preparation for the submission, we don't really need to consider those IDs, but just so you know that we will have to store them in the future once they are generated. One of the main impacts will be the packaging. We have a slide dedicated to this, but the complexity will be way higher because of the granularity and how the packaging is defined in objects. We have to include all the information about the manufacturers that was not reported in the past, the comorbidity, there's some additional regulatory information that was not covered before. But let's not focus on those details, because if we go field by field, we could be talking about ISO IDMP for, I don't know, but a few days probably. So in order to actually comply with ISO IDMP and the steps towards this smooth transition, maybe this would be the actual start of the presentation. these are what we have defined as the steps towards this implementation. So first, it would be understanding the data that has to be reported. So this is just the actual going through the guidances and understanding what EMA wants from you as an EMA holder. Then you have to understand what you have and where you're storing this information, if you have it or not, where you can get it, who can give you access to this information. Then you have to actually define all the processes. So on how you capture the information, on how you will send it to EMA, when, who will be responsible. You will probably have to update all the SOPs and work instructions, not only the ones you already have for the XEVMPD, but you have to accommodate all the new processes. And of course, you can also go beyond compliance, and this is what we usually recommend to everybody. So I'm not gonna lie, this is a big burden. It's something that nobody wants to do because it's dedicating a lot of time and resources in general just to being compliant. So the best approach would be just taking this burden and creating the opportunity to always improve and be better. So now let's just go step by step on the different steps we have towards the implementation. So the first one would be understanding the data. So I mentioned it before, but ISO IDMP is this series of ISO standards and technical specifications prepared by the ISO. They are detailing how the product should be defined and identified on a global level. So you can read the standards, but it's a rather complicated lecture. Maybe you will not understand really what you have to do in the future in order to comply. So this is why we have the European implementation guidance. So EMA had to take those ISOs and prepare a guidance on how these ISOs translates in Europe. So in this guidance is where we can actually get the understanding of what information needs to be reported, how, when, all the transition, everything is covered in these guidances. There will be further updates with clarifications, but since the version 2.0 that was released in February, I mentioned this before, we have most of the information that we need, at least for starting the project. So just to mention it, because I think I have I have a slide in here, is a little bit of the structure of the European implementation guidance. It can be a little bit overwhelming at the beginning. So the first step would be understanding what we have in this guidance and how to read it. So maybe the most important chapters would be chapter 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is the biggest one. I think it's almost 200 pages at the moment, but it's the one that goes field by data field, explaining if it's mandatory or not, what the conditions are, what are the options to include this information, where we should get it from a little on a validation point of view. And then in chapter 3, they are really describing the whole process. When you should report, how you should report, the difference in the implementation for the centralized procedures and the non-centralized procedures. So mostly everything is covered in there, but there will be further classifications in the new version of the guidance for sure. Then chapters 4, 5, and 9, they are not released yet. So they are scheduled for version 3 of the guidance. We can expect that not this year for sure. And then chapter 6 and 7, they remain unchanged since the version 1. Maybe chapter 7 is an interesting reading because this is the one that is defining how EMA will migrate our data that is currently in XEVMPD into PMS, the database IDMP compliant, let's say. So with this migration guide, we kind of get an understanding on those fields that were going to be migrated on a one-to-one basis. and which ones will have wallet transformations. So which ones we have to really, let's say, really check after the migration. So we get the whole idea on the migration process. This is the example I was mentioning about the packaging. So at the moment in XEVMPD, we have this package description field. It's just a simple text box where we can copy and paste the information we have in section 6.5 of the SMPC. So in this example, it's just a product with several pack sizes. They are all in blisters. But in case we report this product in PMS and not in XEVMPD, well, the granularity is way higher. It's not just a simple text box. We have to make a division of the different pack sizes, and then pack size per pack size, we define all the information. This will be general, the package description, the language of the SMPC probably, and then we mention the pack size, then the PCID, the one we mentioned before, will be generated, so it will be different depending on the pack size. And then we go step by step, we define our box, how many boxes, usually one, and the material, and inside this box we have this blister, this material of the blister. And finally, we define the manufacturer item, which would be our tablet, and how many of them we have. So just splitting this simple text box into these 4 objects and the different parts of this object, it's something that will take some time. If you have several pack sizes, multiply this by the number of marketing authorizations you have, and you can get an idea on the amount of work you have to do just to differentiate the packaging. And as we saw before, it's not only the packaging, it's way more what is changing. So once we understand what we have to report, we have to understand how we have it. So first of all, we have these 3 questions. Where do we have this information? Is it covered in any document, maybe in the SMPC, or is it in our dossier, or is it something that we have to request to the marketing team because they are the ones with this information, or maybe the people at production and we have to call them every time we need this information. And then if we have it actually captured somewhere, is it document? For example, is it the SMPC, or do we have it as data, maybe in a database? Because it's always way easier to work with data than work with documents, because with data we can just apply some filters and make a quick search. But if we have to actually go through the documents, opening them, if it's in English, maybe it's easier, but then you have to deal with products in other languages where you're maybe not familiar with. This can be way complicated. And of course, as we mentioned before, this ISO IDMP data model is wide. It's not affecting only regulatory affairs. We have information that may be generated by different departments. And this is just an example on how we will work on this. Whatever company it is, we made up for an example, but this is something we usually see in a lot of clients. So every department is working in their silos, and even in the same department, there are different silos as well. So maybe some people are working with this database that it's common and is getting information from several departments, but then in this other department, they use Excel, but it's not only that they have this huge Excel with all the information, but every different officer have their own Excel, and not everybody have access. So maybe you are requesting this information because you need it for tomorrow. You call this person, but they say, no, sorry, this person is actually on holiday, so you will have to wait a whole week until they are back. This is why it is recommended not to have all this information scattered, but have it in one single place, maybe this common database that is interconnected in the different departments, or a RIM system. So actually the RIM system option is something that we will mention a lot during this presentation. Once we understand what data we have to report and what data we actually have in our house, we have to understand all the different processes. So I mentioned this before, but you should actually focus on chapter 3 for this, so we can understand what the process from EMA are. So all the timelines, different requirements, we have to understand the target operating model, we will see it now. Maybe understand also how the data will be migrated from XEVMPD to PMS, and finally how we are going to define the enrichment depending on what EMA will request. Then we have to check our processes. So as we said before, we have to update all the SOPs and working instructions. We have to understand also what activities inside our company triggers these changes on PMS data fields. So we can identify in our work instructions that whenever there is a change in that activity or whatever data is generated, we have to talk to the person or department responsible for submitting this information to EMA, so they actually do it in time. And then we have to also consider the current processes we have. So it's not only XEVMPD, this is something that will also impact publishing. So I think there will be a lot of work instructions updating here. And well, of course, as part of processes, you have to define the strategy of your company. So who's going to be responsible of generating this? Sorry, I didn't mention it before, but the FIR message is, so the FIR would be the standard that will be used for communicating the information of our products to PMS. So when we are talking about the actual message that it's sent to EMA or that it's included in the sequence, we call it FIR. I mention it now because we will see it in other graphics in the next slides. So I hope it's clear now. And also, as part of the strategy, we really have to define if we just want to go and be compliant with EMA, or if we take this as an opportunity to improve. So it can be maybe the perfect moment to get a RIM system with our company, for example. So in this understanding of the process, of course, what we have to understand is what the EMA implementation plan will be. So at the moment, we are in this point where the go live of this product master services is not released yet. So the starting point or the trigger for this implementation was the release of the European Implementation Guidance version 2.0 in February this year. So what it's notified, at least until now, or what it's official, is that the go live will not happen before 12 months of this release of the guidance. So that means that it will not be before February 2022. Okay. Let's just suppose that it will happen on February next year. So this would be the starting point, or the go live, when we can start sending information to PMS. So it will be optional for both centralized authorized procedures and non-centralized authorized products, sorry, not procedures. So this is what will be the process we have now. We are still sending on XEVMPD. We will be still be sending the information of our products to XEVMPD until the go live. Then there is this big transition period. So this part in here in the middle is what we call step 1. So step 1 is divided in 2. Since the go live of the PMS until it's actually enforced. So that means there is a point in here in the middle when the centralized products, it will be mandatory for them to report the information to PMS. So this is supposed to be with the implementation of the version 3 of the guidance, and what we have on dates at the moment. Again, is that it will not be before February 2023. So this can all move depending on when this happens. And we're always moving in those not less than 12 months periods, let's say. And then finally, at some point, is where we go to step 2, where it will be mandatory for the non-centralized. So I'm not actually going to focus on this now because I think we have a slide later to explain it more, a little bit more. But in this step 1, we have 2 different processes. We have the current XEVMPD one that is the one that will be probably used for the non-centralized procedures, and also for the optionally until it's mandatory for the centralized ones. But then we will have also the process for sending the information to PMS. As we said before, the data will be migrated by EMA into PMS. So this is not something you have to worry at the moment. You don't have to really do this migration. EMA will do it. But basically, they are building this new database that will be PMS. So instead of populating it from scratch again, the data that is in XEVMPD will be migrated here. And well, this whole migration process is well defined. Of course, there is some enrichment that needs to be done because, as we saw before, the information in XEVMPD is, the one in PMS is 3 times bigger than XEVMPD. So all the missing data fields need to be reported somehow. So there will be this initial load on all the authorized human products. So if you have any investigational product registered in XEVMPD, this will not be migrated, at least not at the moment. And then all the data for those products will be generated in PMS. Of course, it will be following the standards that we have in RMS, OMS, and SMS from SPOR. And then we will have what they call the data import and the feedback loop. So this is just a way to have both databases synchronized, let's say. So the delta import means that whenever we make an update on a product on XEVMPD, it will be updated in PMS by this delta import. This way, when we make let's say when we change our way of submission from XEVMPD to PMS, our products will be updated. Imagine it takes us a year to stop using XEVMPD and start sending on PMS. We will have all this information on those updates that happened during that year in XEVMPD. They will be reflected in PMS. Then at the same time, there's this need for maintaining the information in XEVMPD updated with the information that is populated in PMS. Well, not with the information not covered by XEVMPD. But this is also because XEVMPD will not be decommissioned with the go live of PMS. XEVMPD will stay a few years more because there are other services or processes on a general level that are still using XEVMPD information. So this will be kept until everything is transitioned to PMS. So this is why we have this feedback loop as well. So coming back to the current scenario we have now, if you're not that familiar with the submissions with XEVMPD, there's something that is completely post-authorization. So we have this new EMA, or maybe we have a variation, and it's approved by the agency, and then we have to prepare this message. At the end, we send the information to EMA. We're just sending an XML with the information of our product. This is what we call the XEVPRM. Yeah, PRM. Sorry for the pronunciation. And this is the message that we currently send to XEVMPD. So it's updated in this Article 57 database. Article 57 is some other way to call this XEVMPD database, because it comes from the Article 57 of the regulation. And this is where the process should end, or at least most of the people think it ends. But we actually have what they call the acknowledgements. So, and I'm mentioning this because this is something that complicates the whole process. This is a validation that it's done by EMA. So they are actually comparing the information that we send in this XEVPRM with the information we have in the SMPC. So they take both information, the document and the XML. They take also the guidance, and they take the time also to compare and validate that the information reported is the one that is actually in the document. So if they see a difference or something that it's not, that it does not seem correct to them, they just change it and they send a message to you. This is their acknowledgement, saying, hey, we have changed the name of your product. So they actually don't tell you what was the previous name and what is a new one. This is something that you really have to check, and that it's a little bit time consuming, and not all the marketing authorization holders are checking it. So this is creating a problem, let's say, because then the information that we actually have as industry, the information that was reported to the agency, and the information that the EMA have, it can be disaligned. And also we were mentioning that this will be migrated from XEVMPD to PMS. So then all this disalignment will be also kept in PMS, and it's something that we have to check and amend. In order to understand how the different processes will co-live during the step one, and maybe this is the most interesting slide, we have the non-centralized procedures. They will just keep following the XEVMPD process that we saw before. But then for the centralized authorized products, we will have two cases. The ones that are actually subject to regulatory assessment and the ones that are not. So if they are not subject to regulatory assessment, it's quite simple, let's say. It will be preparing this message. Remember, it's the FIR message instead of XEVPRM in this case. And once we have this message with all the information of our products and the changes, it's directly reported to this PMS database. But if it's subject to regulatory assessment, then it goes through this cycle. So we have to prepare the FIR message, and we have to include it in our ECTD. So then the idea is that this FIR message is validated during the actual validation of our submissions. There is something missing in here, but if we have a closing sequence, then it will just be uploaded to PMS. If there is not a closing sequence for validation purposes, then it has to be directly submitted by the holder. This is something that will be further defined in the future. Then, of course, we have the last step, and maybe it's the most important one, and it's going beyond compliance. So we have seen how to understand what the EMA will require from us. We have to do all the work of understanding what we have and how we want to have it, and then the different processes that we will follow in order to achieve it. But this is only for compliance, because ISO IDMP will be mandatory at some point, so we have to send all this information of our products. So instead of just stopping here and having all this part and all these different activities that we have to follow now, we can actually go beyond that. We can define the strategy that our company will have. Maybe you want to follow different steps and you want to focus only on compliance at the beginning, but then take this opportunity of standardization to make a bigger project in the company that will impact the way you capture your data and how you communicate between the departments or affiliates. I mean, at the end, the strategy is something that you do in a company level, and it doesn't have to be the same depending on the company. But for sure is something that you have to define, and actually going beyond compliance is always the best option. Then, just so you have in mind, this is a big project. This takes time, it takes investment, and it can take even more depending on how far you want to go. Other idea that we really want you to get out of this webinar is that this is not something exclusive for regulatory affairs. It's something that impacts the whole way we treat the data in our company. So for sure, when we're talking about systems and databases and programs, always involve IT. This also depends on the structure of your company, but maybe you realize now that you have to send all this information and that you have different systems scattered in your company that are really capturing this, and maybe you can have just one single place to report it. And maybe for IT, this is the best because they have to maintain less systems or servers. So always involve them in this. And also related to, because sometimes it's difficult to, let's say, get budget for a project like this. There are some companies that have these global digitalization projects, or they have, as we mentioned before, standardization between the different systems. So they take the opportunity to use this budget to go beyond the compliance and maybe get a RIM solution that covers this, or update the one they currently have in order to accommodate the information for IDMP. And well, then we wanted to give you some examples, like practical cases, let's say, on how the implementation can happen for this model of company. So this is a company with a large portfolio. They have centralized procedures and non-centralized procedures. So they can actually just face everything for the whole portfolio and have one single process, or they see that they have no time in order to implement this, so they focus on the centralized products first, and then with the non-centralized, I mean, options are limitless, and it's always about building the strategy of the company. And when we have these three of questions, so then the first one would be, we're this company with a large portfolio, we already have a RIM in place. So it's not that you have a RIM and that's it, you're ready to go. You have to actually make an analysis of the information you have in there. Maybe there are some data fields that you're not covering in your system, or that your system covers, but you're not actually tracing it for the products. So maybe you have to make an enrichment in this system, or you have to go through an update of the system first, so it's IDMP compliant, and then you make your data compliant. This step of making your data audit is something that you definitely have to do, and you cannot just leave it for the last minute, because then, well, especially taking into account that it's a large portfolio, is not something that you will achieve in 1 month. Then we also have to ask the question if our RIM system is, well, we have the information in there, but then is it capable of creating this FIR message? Because you can have a nice database with all the information in one single place, but then you can either click a button and you get this message ready and you're ready for submission, or it does not have this function, and at least you have a place where you can check that the information is up to date, and it's one single place. You don't have to call people that is on holiday, but then you will have to prepare all these FIR messages with an external tool, maybe the user interface that will be provided by EMA in the future. This is something we don't have really much information about in the moment, because it's not, well, it's still in the making. But then we have all these other options where we don't have a RIM system. So the first one would be considering if we really need a RIM system, and well, if we need one, but getting the budget, starting the project. This is not something that happens from one day to another as well. It's a long process of understanding which would be the best RIM solution for your company. It's not only depending on the size, but all the different user requirements. And then you can start making this implementation in parallel. But first you have to consider that your RIM system will be actually IDMP compliant. And once you try to migrate all the information to this new RIM system, you can either take the opportunity during the migration to make all this enrichment, so you accommodate all the information that you did not have before, or maybe you just migrate. You have this iteration where you make a go live in your RIM system, and then you do a project at a later stage where you do the full enrichment. So that will be an option. Also here we have to consider if the RIM system is capable of FIR submissions or not. This will be the same case as here. But then maybe we decide we don't need this RIM, or we're not going through this at the moment. So the steps are kind of similar. We still have to analyze where we have our data, where do we have an in-house database that was prepared by our IT system 10 years ago. Is there a possibility to add the extra data fields we need for this? Maybe we don't need a system that we click a button and prepares the information, but at least a system where we can store it and have it up to date. So all of these considerations and data audit is something that you for sure need to do, and also check the different steps you will take towards preparing this FIR submission at the end. Then we have this second case. It will be a company that only have non-centralized authorized products, and it has a really small portfolio. So they should also consider if there's an option to implement this RIM in order to fully digitalize and go a step ahead. As I said before, it's not mandatory. Nobody's going to force you to get a RIM system in order to comply, but it's always a good option. So it will be exactly the same case we saw before. We can do this implementation in parallel and enriching in the import tables. So once we have our new system with all our products, we have all the information that we need, or maybe we do it in the future. But also there is this possibility that the same, we don't have this RIM system, we are not going to implement it, but we for sure have to find a way. Even though we only have 2 or 5 marketing authorizations, we need to understand what kind of information will be required. And if we have, I don't know, maybe we have an Excel where we are storing this information, we need to really understand what information we need to capture, because maybe there are some information that we are not capturing at the moment because it's something we think it's not for us. So maybe it's the moment to align Excels between the company as well. And then finally, of course, we have to see how we can help you from Aspalion. So we can help you through the whole process. First, understanding your data. Understanding their data, what has to be reported. We can offer you company trainings and consultancy support. We can help you understand your data as well. So we can support you during the gap analysis and all these data audits to see how compliant to ISO IDMP your current systems are, and what would be the next steps towards having this compliance. We can support you during the enrichment. So once we have identified what information is missing, and we have identified who is the owner of this data, we can help you fill in this information. We can support you understanding the process as well. So all the different work instructions and SOPs that will have to be updated, we can support you with this. We can support you also defining the project, the different steps to achieve this compliance. And finally, we can support you going beyond that compliance with the definition of the company strategy. And also, if as part of this strategy you are considering implementation of a RIM system, we can, of course, support you with that. And finally, but not least, another option is just externalizing this these activities. So all PMS submission, FIR preparation, or for maintenance is something we can support you with as well. And I think we still have 4 minutes for questions. I don't know if you want to add something, Lidia, as well. You're in mute, Lidia.
Sorry. Sorry about this. Thank you very much indeed, Ramon, for your talk. And if there is any question from the audience, otherwise you can always write your questions to us. I have a question.
Tell.
When you talk about Ramon, in that decision tree, when we generate the FIR and when we do not, and it depends on if the variation or the change we make is something that requires assessment or does not require assessment. In this first decision tree, yes, no? Yeah.
Yes.
Can you explain the examples? Because this will be a situation that will happen often, and maybe there are people in the audience that maybe want to have this more clarified on what is to be assessed and what is not to be assessed.
Okay. So if we take an example of what is happening with XEVMPD at the moment, we said this is completely post-authorization. So we have this new EMA or a variation, and this is something you would do with your national competent authority or EMA if it were centralized, and then you report it in XEVMPD. But in the past, we have seen that some kind of variations can be avoided. So this is the case, for example, of a change on the QPPB or the location of the pharmacovigilance master file. So they are not treated as variation anymore. They are done directly through XEVMPD. So we can expect something similar in the future in PMS. So they have to accommodate that process, that it's not going through our procedure in the ECTD, it's something that is reported directly into PMS. But there are also some considerations that we did not talk about it. But for example, as it is, well, it's actually a lot of effort for the industry to transition to ISO IDMP. One of the proposals is that we avoid some administrative variations. For example, I don't know, changing the name of a manufacturer. So instead of creating our whole variations and compiling sequences and sending it to the agencies, in the future, they may not be subject to regulatory assessment, and it can be a similar case of the change of QPPD.
Thank you, Ramon. That's clear.
I don't know if we have any question in the chat because I have no access to it now.
I don't see any question in the chat. Can my colleagues Cristina and Lidia confirm? But I cannot see any. In any case,
Lidia, we can confirm there's no questions there.
Okay.
Okay. In this case, it's now time to close the session. It's 4 o'clock. So just I have just to say thank you to all you. Thank you especially to Ramon for this talk and for this presentation. And thank you for attending. If there is any question, you can always address it to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.